All right, this is the December 2015 Without a Roof radio program. I'm very, very pleased to have in the studio audience Ed Mayer, the Executive Director of the Housing Authority of Butte County. Welcome to the studio, Ed.
Hi, Bill. Nice to be here. Thank you.
You know, I have to do the appropriate introductions for Mr. Mayer. Mr. Mayer, Ed Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R, him and I became friends through the Mayor's Task Force. And I kind of joke later, I said the best thing that happened from the Mayor's Task Force was meeting and getting to know Ed Mayer. But him and I basically were tasked to come up with the problem statement. And I was really blessed, Ed. I mean that with all my heart. I was able to spend 3 separate hours on 3 separate occasions in a room, locked in a room with Ed Mayer. And I really got to know your heart and a little bit of your story, how you were Ivy League college, and you literally were working in the development industry, and you kind of had a change, and you said, hey, look, you know, I want to do something for my community, you know, and now you're doing that with the Housing Authority of Butte County. But before I turn it over to you, because I've told this story at least every 3 months, I said, Ed Mayer went to Phillips Academy in Andover, same academy as Mr. George Bush Jr., correct? Correct. And can't make this stuff up. 76, I walked past Ed's alma mater, Phillips Academy, Andover, Massachusetts, 213 as a runaway heading to Boston. So welcome to the studio, Ed. Anything you could add to that? Add to the allure of Ed Mayer before we get talking about housing?
Oh my, that's quite an introduction, Bill. No, it's just a great privilege to serve and to serve a community, to serve others. My life has become service through the experience of my travels through this country. And we get to sit right now on the front lines of this great scenario unfolding in this country, this discrepancy in wealth and the great disadvantages not enjoyed by an enormous part of our population who seem to be either systematically disenfranchised, marginalized, whatever. We're not getting after this issue of housing people. And to me, trained as an architect, when someone doesn't have a house, it is a cruel reality. I react viscerally when I see someone who does not have a home, because as human beings dwelling on this planet, there are a few things that are very important to us being human beings: food, shelter, and clothing. And in this country, we don't generally lack for food or clothing, but we are often finding ourselves lacking for housing. And housing is so essential to the human condition that without it, it's very difficult to act like a human being. And so instantly, with those who are not housed versus those who are housed, we have a dialectic, and it often ends up being very judgmental. Cutting through all that to solutions and actions, really the recognition that the homeless are very much a part of our community, that most of the homeless we see are actually from our community. They're community members who really, truly, whether through their own actions or others' actions or systems, for whatever reason, have fallen, they become disenfranchised. And we need, as a community, to solve the issue, to just simply embrace this population as ours and treat them with respect and kindness and provide the housing they need so that we all can enjoy a community that is fair and offers a level playing field for both opportunity as well as life.
Yeah, because I've done some training. I call myself a professional backpacker because I started a group, and a hiking group, and I've been to 2 separate survival classes, and they, first and foremost, all throughout the class, your number one thing, you're in a survival situation, shelter. Shelter, shelter, shelter. You know, so I can't possibly say enough about that. The other thing that brings a little bit of pause to me, I see areas in the country, Ed, where I see some really good things going on, like Eugene. They pretty much said, hey, we're going to set up areas for people to camp. But by and large, those are little pockets of I'm calling it sanity. But literally, you and I, when we first met, now it's been about 3 years, we were talking about how we're becoming more like a caste system where we're figuring out, you know, who's got the money and who doesn't, and we kind of push those people out. And as an advocate who's worked very heavy in this space, we've slid, in my estimation, in the last 3 years in regards to, you know, physically embracing the fact, like you had said, community is everyone, and we need to help these folks. I mean, what would you say to that?
Well, all I can say is I grew up in a world where you didn't see homeless on the streets. You certainly didn't see them in the downtown parks. You occasionally saw what we used to call hobos. And so there is this, how should I say, out of the homeless population that we've studied and worked with, we know that there's this one component of it, small, about 10 to 15% of what I would call professional homeless. And these are individuals and or families who've really kind of opted out of our system. They don't want to have checkbooks. They don't want to pay taxes. They don't want to mess with insurance. Life gets complicated in our society. They've opted out for a different way. And generally, when I'm talking about this population, is fairly self-sufficient. They're able to move about the country and through communities, knowing what services to get, picking up part-time work. They generally are lower impact. The population we're most concerned with, though, are those with mental health issues and or substance abuse problems. Being on the streets creates its own layers of trauma, which are layered upon whatever original layers of trauma are there. And getting after those who really are not in a position to help themselves without other assistance. So we've moved into a new world reality. Back in the mid-'80s, when I first went to India, I first confronted what we call homelessness on a large scale. Ironically, my exposure to Asia showed me that while many, many populations there are extremely poor, they're materially, they're extremely wealthy in terms of their families, their communities, their sense of being in their society, a very rich spiritual tradition. So ironically, despite the incredible poverty confronted in Asia, I found a great deal of joy there as well. In our country, flip the situation. We have enormous material well-being. We have food, we have shelter, we have clothing generally, comparatively speaking to Asia. But we have these enormous mental health problems in our society that I think result from, they're sourced in isolation, and they're sourced in the difficulty of negotiating a modern industrialized society as a human being. So we have a different problem. Our problem here has to do with the satisfaction and mental stability of our society. And obviously, with the deinstitutionalization of our mental institutions back in the 70s and the 80s, we're still sitting here today looking for Plan B. What do we do with this population we just deinstitutionalized? Short of embracing that population, we just create problems. And there is hope. In the last 20 years, we have seen communities actually effectively grapple with homelessness and wrestle it down. Salt Lake City right now has no effective homelessness. And they've been able to combine local resources. My understanding is it's the Mormon Church, which has helped provide the social services, and then the local housing authorities and state agencies who come in with the rental assistance. And so you end up with a package delivered to the homeless persons that includes housing and supportive services, unconditional in a sense, so that people can establish a foothold, a beachhead, and move forward with their lives. They've done it. And what is interesting about the lesson is, despite the federal resources and state resources we have to rely on, really, when we look to successful solutions to homelessness, it always involves a community that at the local level has stood up and said, not here. We take ownership of this problem and we'll address it.
Yeah, I can say that's physically what I see in Eugene, Oregon, so in other places, in Salt Lake City, like you had said. But maybe to just kind of continue back onto that whole survival thing, what I said about shelter, Ed, and you talked about it, and I'm talking about it again, is it's a primal need. It's your lowest need. You need shelter. You physically need shelter to survive and thrive as a human being. And any of these services, to me, we're throwing money at the wind. Because any of these services where you're actually, doing drug and alcohol counseling or mental health counseling or prescription drugs, or all these different things you can do, if the person is physically outside, your chance of success is below 1%, in my opinion, of actually working with folks on the street. So absolutely, we need to freaking get people housed above and beyond whatever other issues they have. And actually going through the HUD VASH program, working with Bobby Walden out of the VA, he had a really good point. He said, because I kind of consider myself pretty stable person, and I think you had even made the point when I said I was a submariner. He says, you must be really healthy mentally, or whatever. You said something like that. But, I mentioned to Bobby, and he kind of really got me thinking about it, Ed. He said, no, anyone that's homeless is suffering some level of mental trauma. Mm-hmm. And I started to go, you know what? I started to piece it together, going some of the things that I was dealing with, the trauma of being on the street and wondering where you're going, what's going to happen to you and everything else. So I can't, emphasize that enough for our listeners. But let's get your sweet spot. I mean, as far as, your level of expertise and what you're helping in Butte County tremendously with the housing realm. I'd made the comment on the James Lee Clark interview that you had mentioned to me that we used to be able to help 3 out of 5. Now we can only help 2 out of 5. So maybe describe what that 2 out of 5 means for folks that don't know. Because what I also find, Ed, is a lot of people that just kind of are on the peripheral of this issue, they just figured it's figured out. If someone needs a house, they knock on Butte County Housing in their house. So, hey, we're seeing someone out here. How come they're not getting help? So if you could kind of take it from there.
Sure. Well, the Housing Authority here in Butte County, we administer about 3,100 units of rental assistance in the area. We own and operate about 1,000 units of housing, and we have about 2,100 vouchers and other forms of rental assistance that we provide to homeless and low-income and extremely low-income households. The great irony here is that I'll start by saying there isn't enough housing in the community, and I'll just use Chico as an example. The difficulty is, since the Great Recession, is our vacancy rates in the community have declined to the point where we're now at 1% or less. We even think the one-bedroom and studio market is at about 0.75% vacancy rate, which, given the relative growth rate of this community, which is around somewhere between 1 and 2.5% per year, is not enough vacancy to provide for new lease-ups, new tenancies. Yeah. So we issue vouchers to voucher holders who go out to look for units to rent in the private sector, which we would then subsidize, and they simply cannot find the units. Very, very difficult. So our community's ability to produce housing has been truncated. And then how do you produce housing that's affordable relative to the incomes that are seen in this area? Very, very difficult. We are considered a high-cost housing area because of the relative nature of rents compared to available incomes. So Butte County is interesting in that it's a nexus for elderly and disabled who need services, need proximity to services, but also need affordable housing. We see many families coming to Butte County from the Bay Area because they can't afford rents in the Bay Area. They can afford a rent here. Imagine if you're a single senior person on Social Security. Let's say you're bringing in about $950 a month. Try and find a one-bedroom or studio apartment in the Chico area. You're probably looking at $600 a month, from $550 at the low end, $700 at the upper end. That doesn't leave a lot of extra money every month for food and life. So we're still a high-cost area. The reason these seniors and disabled come here is because we have relatively affordable housing, and we're close enough to services, whether they're in Chico or we're looking to services in Davis or Sacramento or the Bay Area. You can still get there from here. Redding becomes too far out. So because of the university here in Chico and services enriched area, we have this nexus. So we see these low-income families coalescing around the Chico area because of these economic opportunities are relatively good for California. But as we know, you look across the landscape of California, you look at the Bay Area, you look at the coastal areas, housing prices have gone out of sight. There has not been enough production to meet demand, and that's been systematic for about 30 years now. So as I recall right, California as a whole is short about 1.5 million units of housing. Of course, that drives housing costs up for everyone. And it aggravates this problem of how do we serve this cohort at the bottom. So very, very difficult situation. It's socioeconomic, it's political, but there are solutions, and it just takes commitment and a lot of grit and working with these households. And as you said, once a household's been out on the street, we see layers of trauma. The longer they're out on the street, there's more and more trauma, which leads me to this discussion of the two different kinds of assistance that we've seen provided to the homeless over the last 30 years since the federal government has gotten involved in housing the homeless with the McKinney Act back in the late 1980s. Originally, the federal funds supported emergency shelters and transitional housing because it was felt that pulling folks off the street, they needed to, be retrained in how to live. They needed services delivered so that they could, come down off their homelessness experience. Given some time, given some work, given supportive services, and finally the idea would be that after some time in transitional housing, 3 months to 2 years, 3 years, that they'd be ready to go out and live in permanent supportive housing. There's a new paradigm out there that the federal government is promoting, and it's called Housing First, and basically it means taking a homeless person off the street or a homeless household, putting them in a house and blanketing them in social services. It's a great idea. It works really well, but it works really well in places where you have dense supportive service networks, which is not characteristic of rural areas like Butte County. So in Butte County, we find ourselves with a bit of a mix. Our experience on the ground says that we need emergency shelters, we also need transitional facilities, but we also need housing first. So all three models are appropriate, and in different ways we have programs operating in the county that reflect all three paths to rehousing.
Right. As a quality engineer, they used to say, solve your problems early on. It costs you less money and it's less arduous. And I want to lead into something that Covenant House, they do a lot of work with youth throughout North America. And they have a quote. They said, with homeless youth, hours count. People talk about days and weeks, but if you're a homeless youth at risk, you're being preyed upon. The longer you're out there on the street, the more likely you are to be out there. So the housing first is absolutely critical. We've got to help people physically as soon as they hit the street, or preferably before, because as you said, Ed, affordable housing, more housing stocks, less occupancy, higher unoccupancy rates means there's more housing stock. It's a rising tide that lifts all boats. Because so many communities throughout the country, including here in Butte County, which is a poor county, let's just face it, a lot of people are paying 40, 50, 60% of their rent or more of their income. Which leads me to actually one question. Maybe you can actually obviously add on to that. But what is the level when we're talking about 2 out of 5, 3 out of 5? What is the level of income that puts them at risk, percentage?
Oh, well, anytime a household is paying more than 30% of its income towards rent and utilities is a red flag. When we see rent and utility payments amounting to more than 35% of a household's income, we know that household is in stress. When it's above 50%, it's in serious stress. And in Chico alone, and this is from the city's general plan documents and census data from the last census, so it's a little dated, but if anything, things have gotten worse. In Chico, 30% of the households in Chico pay more than 50% of their income towards rent and utilities, which tells you we have a very serious problem in this community, because all of those households, if they have children in them, believe me, mom, dad, they're working 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet, keep a roof over the head. The kids are coming home to an empty house, latchkey kids, they get in trouble. Anyways, these enormous stressors on the family, whether you're talking about substance abuse or domestic violence or the unraveling of the family, it's expensive to deal with those issues. And it's really a function of economic distress, not lack of job, either lack of job opportunity or lack of affordable housing, either side of the same coin. The point is that families are struggling to make it here, and if they lose a job or if someone gets sick, very often they lose their housing. So then they show up in the social services sector for a single individual to provide rental assistance to an individual who was homeless for a year might cost us, on average, in fact, our average subsidy to households in this county is about $375 a month. For singles coming off the street with special needs, we will see rent subsidies of about $7,500 a year would take care of their housing need. And if we throw in another $7,500 to $10,000 a year in supportive services, that household then all of a sudden has housing and is stabilized, and is no longer incurring these outrageous costs associated with police intervention or visits to the emergency room. We can stop those households from cycling in the emergency room.
As we get closer to the end of the interview, I know it'd be recent if we didn't actually talk a little bit about the Section 8 housing process. Now, I know the actual waiting list was closed for so long because there were so many freaking people on it that you described how short we are in housing, but I think you just went through a process that was on the 30th or something where you opened up a lottery. So literally, folks that are listening, and Ed's going to give us the details, there's so few housing stock for people that need it. This 30% of all the community families in the community are more than 50%, that they're going to a lottery system. So maybe you could take it from there.
Our Section 8 program, we just opened up our wait list for the first time since 2012. In 2012, we had received 4,500 applications for housing, and it's taken us until now to work through those applications. Sadly, out of those applications, we would typically call in about 30 to 50 households a month. Of the households we would call in from that wait list, we would only see about 50% show up. And of those who showed up, we would only see about 50% lease up. So for those who were on the wait list, probably only about 1 in 4 got served. We just recently reopened the wait list here in November. It's closed now, and in the 1 month it was opened, we received 5,500 applications. There may be some duplicates in there. We haven't run through the wait list to call them from duplicates, but that's a lot of applicants in 1 month's time. And this year, we're changing our routine a little bit. We're going to go ahead and do a lottery out of that 5,500 and pick 1,000 households, because that's about the number of households we run through in a year in terms of offering vouchers and leasing up. So we think what the idea here is that we would take this 1,000 households. They'll be fresh waiting list. We'll work through them. We're going to be prioritizing veterans this year, so any household that has a veteran in it will be housed first. So we expect that in the first part of this year, first 6 months of 2016, we'll be housing primarily veteran embedded households. But we are only going to pick 1,000 households out of that 5,500 because we want to be able to open up the waiting list again next year and annually, so that there's a better chance for folks to actually get a shot at that waiting list.
I really appreciate you doing that, because there's so many people I talk to, Ed, that they've given up. They're like, I don't even go because the waiting list is not open. And so you understand that's probably why you changed the process, or maybe other counties have. It's just like people have just given up. They don't even put their name on the list, you know. So now at least they'll be able to get on a list once a year. That should help a lot.
Well, this is why it's a little sad.
Yeah, it is sad.
The Section 8 program, in order to qualify for it, your income has to be below 50% of the area median income for your household size. That's not a very high number, and we prioritize 75% of our admissions have to be to households whose income is 35% of the area median income. So that's really low-income households.
Yeah,
They struggle to lease up because they don't have a good credit history typically. They've had problems. There may be rent issues. Landlord references are difficult. There may be criminal history, etc. So very challenging for these extremely low-income households, even with a voucher, to find and secure housing. So the bigger picture here, though, is, of course, that is the number of folks who live in Butte County whose income falls below 50% of median income who never have a shot at affordable housing. Butte County, to its credit, the people here are strong and mighty, and they do what's necessary to survive, and survival often involves creation of very interesting communities and families. So we see the homeless creating their own communities and their own families, their own support networks. But and then we have enormous charities here, great open-hearted charitable community providing a lot of supportive services. But what we haven't gotten down to really is the nut of this, which is simply the provision of affordable housing. It's a longstanding political dynamic in this country, this issue of fair housing, housing for all. Where do people live? What do we do with minorities? How do we provide a level playing field and neighborhoods of opportunity, as opposed to neighborhoods that reflect values and development styles that do not serve the greater community.
One more question I'm going to have you, but I just want to add the fact, just to remember, folks, that these people that you see out there are somebody's brother, they're somebody's son, they're somebody's aunt, they're somebody's sister. And it's so hard to get detached from it if you're not working in the trenches like Ed and I are. But a lot of these households you're talking about, Ed, have very small children, you know, 0 through you know, high school. And the impact on these kids is just devastating. You know, they can see what's going on for their parents. They're hustling around, sleeping on couches, trying to figure out where they're going to go for food, having to go down to the, you know, food banks and food and Jesus Center and stuff like that. So, you know, I just want to kind of emphasize that with the listeners. This is a really significant problem here in Butte County and beyond. But I'd like to leave with, though, Ed, is give me something positive. Just kind of think about this a second. I want to end on a positive note, because Ed's a really positive individual. So I'm going to leverage that now.
The message is this is a problem that can be solved. If anyone tells you this is an impossible, it can't be solved, don't believe them. This can be done. But it requires all of us, from the top down, from the politicians to the service providers to the community at large, to the churches, the social workers, to the families of these persons who are homeless. It's going to take us all together to do it. We've seen it done elsewhere. A happy story. When I worked at a housing authority in Missoula, Montana, we had a terrible homeless problem. This was back in the 1990s. Many persons with serious mental illness out on the street. And I would regularly have come visit to my office mothers of these homeless, mentally ill persons out on the streets. And they would beg me, please do something to get our children off the streets. We can't manage our children. We can't handle them. We're not equipped to deal with them. But they're on the streets and they're homeless and they're suffering terribly. There were the Alliance for the Mentally Ill. The women had gathered up, and I was very happy to be able to deliver at that time McKinney Act funds from the federal government to provide a shelter plus care program. We provided rental assistance. We entered into a partnership with our local mental health organization to provide supportive services, and we got 90 homeless, mentally ill persons off the street in a year, and it just changed the whole community. And I never heard from the mothers again. But it's possible. We can do this, and it must be together.
All right, Ed, I'm gonna end with a without a roof staple. Give me 5, man.
All right.
Let's make sure we get it on the mic.
All right, Bill. Thank you.
Ed, thanks again. I'm going to have you back on because, there's so much stuff that we could cover in a short period of time. But once again, I thank you for coming in, KZFR Without a Roof radio program.